Good morning, everyone. Now, thing is this, I'm all alone by myself, and there is nobody who is a techie to help me. So there's every chance I might make one or two mistakes. They're just gonna have to manage me like that today. I believe today should teach me the lesson that I should always ensure there is a techie person available by my side. So manage me the way you can. I'll be happy to see your feedback. I would be checking my Twitter feed and the Facebook because for some weird reason, the cursor on this laptop has decided that it has a life all of its own, or rather, a mind of its own, and it's just gone crazy on me. Like I said, I'm a Luddite and I'm all alone. But here's the thing. Um, we're meant to be talking constitution this morning, and we did say we'll start at 11, and it's now 11 o'clock. So my name remains Dele Farotimi. I am hopeful that you can see me. I'm not getting any kind of feedback, but this button does say live, so I would imagine that I'm live and I'll just shoot. So I did post my lesson notes earlier today, and I still have them here, so you can actually follow. I do not presume to be an expert on constitutional matters. I am also not a constitutional lawyer, even though in a former life I did practice as a lawyer. But even then, I was not a constitutional lawyer. So do not consider me an expert whose words you might not impeach. So please do feel free to impeach my positions. Arguments only refine reasoning when undertaken by men of reason. So this morning, my intention is that we talk constitution. Question is, why do we need to talk constitution? When you look at the different afflictions of the Nigerian and you listen to the different diagnoses and suggestions about how to come out of our mess, what you find very quickly is something analogous to what my professor of property law in the university, Professor 1.0 Smith, I.O. Smith, he used to say at his inaugural, each time, the first lecture with property law students, Professor Smith was always fond of saying, oh, ignorance is having a meeting and knowledge is in attendance. He was an expert in his field, so he could speak as derisively as he did to those of us who are a student, even though it was a way of piquing our interest and getting us to pay attention because he did have a lot of knowledge to offer us. I have already explained I am not an expert in constitutional law and I am not seeking to lecture students of constitutional law. However, I am a Nigerian. But being a Nigerian can sometimes be an extremely ambiguous term because the question is, what does that entail? What does that make you? Who are you as a Nigerian? But all these questions are better answered when you look at the centrality of the Constitution in the life of any country and to the inhabitants of that country. So it is very important that we do talk Constitution this morning. And there is a danger about miseducation that I would beg that you allow me the arrogance of saying that I was forced to learn some of these things and I used to think they were unproductive until the level of miseducation and ignorance that has been weaponized against the Nigerian people makes it imperative that we have these basic conversations with ourselves. I do not seek to speak above people. My intention is to teach. So I will ask the indulgence of the experts who might be expecting certain level of perhaps linguistic specificities, perhaps a lot of things might be expected of me by those who would judge me as an expert. Understand clearly that I do not pretend to be one. Caveat having been properly entered, let me also say I am not ignorant when it comes to the question of constitution. So, what is a constitution? Let me first of all take you away from a law classroom and bring you into a life situation. You know that market association. Okay, let me not make it that granular because the market woman is unlikely to be listening in on this broadcast. So let me bring it home to the people who are most likely going to be the demographics listening to me. So let's say, for instance, that good, your town union. In your town union, there will be several people and interests in any town. So in that town union, when you are setting up, say for instance, Ibadan Progressive Union, if you're finding such an organization, there must be a body of rules and regulation that governs the affairs of each and every member of such an association or organization. The document you bring together to govern the activities and structures of the organization, we sometimes generally refer to it as the constitution of the organization. So social clubs would have constitutions, town unions would have constitutions, businesses have articles of associations and all that. So essentially, a constitution is just another word for an agreement by which the people to whom it applies have agreed to be ruled. That is all a constitution is. The set of rules by which the people agree to be ruled, that sets up their governance structures, that determines who gets what, when and how, that sets the boundaries of the relationship between multiple levels of governance, and then the relationship and obligations between the state and the citizens. Now, that is the important word that has always been missing in the Nigerian contemplation of our constitution: citizens. Citizens make constitutions. Parliaments do not make constitutions. Parliaments make laws. Citizens make constitutions. That might sound crazy to some people, so let me break it down for you. Who is a citizen? We need to understand that words cannot have one meaning at their point of origin and then come into Nigeria and acquire a different meaning whilst pretending to retain the same meaning as it had at its point of origination. I would explain. The word bogus means false. Everywhere else in the world, the dictionary will show you clearly bogus means false. But I have said this before, Nigeria is where the English language came to die. So the word bogus got to Nigeria and we tweaked it, and today it means big. So it's got a bogus house, so it's a big house. It's not dissimilar to the word citizen in Nigeria. When a constitution is to be made, we must understand that states are the ones that make constitutions. So when you now are talking about a constitution, you are presuming that one, there were people living in a geographical space who have agreed to live together as one within that geographical space. That geographical space are the boundaries of the state they have created by their collective will. Now, having come together to live within that geographical space, they now express their will as free human beings, which is where you come from with the fundamental human rights. So these human beings agree to donate their fundamental rights in all spheres of their lives, except the ones that are deemed so important that might not be touched even by the government or the state. So these citizens, expressing their free will, find for themselves a constitution, the set of rules by which they will be living. Nigeria, in many ways, is not a state in the sense contemplated when these terminologies were being used. We, by accident of colonialism, never got to sit down together to agree whether we wanted to form even Yoruba, the Yorubas who consider themselves most homogeneous. There was never any homogeneous Yoruba nation. Even the Alafin never ruled the totality of the Yoruba states. So, but the English came, or the British, I should say, came around, and without really asking too many questions of anyone, got together a few kings here and there. The Oba of Lagos was busy signing away the sovereignty of my village in Imesile. People were busy signing all kinds of fraudulent documents for the British. And Nigeria, first Northern Protectorate, we became what we have become. But even at that, by the time the British were leaving, the sovereign will of the Nigerian people were expressed in some form or the other. Several constitutional conferences were held. Their wills were expressed. Agreements were reached. There were several refinements from 1951 Constitution to the 1954 Constitution, all these under the British supervision and power, the expression of British colonial power, but with the input of the local people. The East and the West were separated in 1939 because it was clear that these were two distinct regions that should function on their own. By the 1951 Constitution, you had three, in fact, in 1946, there were three distinct and clearly administrated regions. And this became the foundation for the modern Nigerian state. But the people in those constituent regions, in different constituent assemblies, expressed their sovereign will. The 1960 Constitution of Nigeria came about as an expression of the sovereign will of the Nigerian peoples, sitting in different forms, but clearly expressing their will. Question is this: the centrality of citizenship to the constitution making process cannot be taken away when affirming the legality or fraudulence of any constitution. Let's imagine, for instance, that in the estate where you live or the street on which you live, the man living 10 streets away decide to come to your street to impose a constitution by which you might govern yourselves on your street. So he decides for you that he actually isn't too happy with the idea of you locking your gates by 12 p.m. That in fact, no, that by, yeah, let's say by 11:30 p.m. So he wants your gate left open until 2 a.m. in the morning. And aside from that, he doesn't like the look of your megad. So he's removing your megad and bringing his own for you. Those are not actions that you would tolerate on your street. Why do you tolerate it as a nation? As simplistic as that might sound, the reality is that a constitution is made by citizens freely expressing their sovereign will and deciding how they wish to live and to be governed. In my lesson note, pointed out something. I said, how were the citizens involved in the 1960 and the 1963 constitution making process? It would interest you to know that at every point, from the beginning of the divestment of colonial authority in Nigeria or its devolution of powers to the constituent parts of Nigeria, one thing that had been consistent is that the centrality of citizens' rights, which were not at the foundation of the creation of the Nigerian state, were allowed unfettered expression. How do I say this? After the 1956 Kanu riots, the colonial secretary, made a recommendation to the crown, and it was to the effect that, look, what they have learned by the Kanu riot is that an attempt at giving Nigeria a constitution that is reflective of British values, but blind to the diversity of Nigeria, which will in effect be a unitarist constitution, would only ensure the breakdown of the state they will be handing over. And he therefore recommended that there should be very clear divisions along the regional lines, and each region should be allowed to develop at its own pace and based on its own cultural and religious inclinations. These were the words of the colonial secretary at the time. Now, if the colonial secretary would see this, if the regional leaders and the people themselves could see this, and they could then determine that the only way to make the state they were forming viable would be to ensure that respect is given to these distinctions amongst the peoples, and each be allowed to develop. And they then created, by agreement, a federation. This federation was put into practice not just before 1960, but it is clearer to see its workings and effect when you look at the emergence of the 1963 Constitution and the process leading up to the creation of the Midwest region in 1962, and by the promulgation of the 1963 Constitution by the federal legislative arm, which then required each of the regions, the three regions, to equally, as an act of the regional parliaments, pass each of the regional constitution. So there were 4 distinct constitutions created in 1963. The federal constitution and the constitution of each of the regions. The Midwest Constitution, I believe, was enacted by the federal legislative arm because it didn't have its own legislature as at that time. Now, these were the things we did as a country. I won't say a nation. Before independence, in the immediate aftermath of the independence, the people's will mattered. The people's will were expressed. The 1963 Constitution, in my view, and this is borne out by the facts of history, remains the last expression of the will of the Nigerian people in any form. The sovereign will of the Nigerian people was brutally cut down in January 1966. And in the immediate aftermath of that cut down, what happened was that as a consequence, Nigeria became a rogue state where the centrality of citizenship was lost. And the sovereign will of the people has been expressed solely by sheer force of arms, brigandage, and patent illegality. The original fraud might have been, the original crime was definitely the first coup. The second coup built on top of the crime. It compounded it. It led to the Civil War. Like I have explained, I am not an expert. I am only a citizen. And I was born in 1968, in the midst of that war. So I'm not old enough to tell you first-hand experience of what transpired. But what I can tell you are the things I have seen with my own eyes as I have grown up in Nigeria, the things I have read and been forced to read over the years in pursuit of one stupid syllabus or the other. I used to think they were useless knowledge. But in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the process began, which substantially began to remake Nigeria and has taken it further and further away from its roots and from the agreements that birthed it. Nigeria is a young nation, if they would ever let it become one. But I'll use the word nation in place of state sometime, maybe because I'll forget, or because it actually sounds romantic to the ears. But Nigeria as a state is pretty young. We're today, 61 years old. At 61, Nigeria is a very young state. But when the foundation is defective, what happens is that you effectively build on top of defects. And eventually, however long it takes, the structure will collapse. The country that was cobbled together and that was birthed in 1960, that was affirmed in 1963, was effectively killed in 1966. It was eventually buried in 1971. Maybe that was 70 at the end of the Civil War. And what effectively happened is that a new Nigeria was birthed. And this Nigeria is not found on law. It was found, and it is found on injustice. Brutal, evil injustice. State capture. Here is what has happened. During the Civil War, Gowon began the process of state creation. So you had a situation where what began as a federation that would never have started as a federation became not a unitary state. Don't let anybody fool you. Britain is unitary. United Kingdom is unitary, but it's got devolved regional assemblies in recognition of the fact that it is still a place of many nationalities. So the Scots have their own assembly, the Welsh have their own assembly, and the English, more or less in conformity with their own decision to expand beyond their space. Yeah, they sometimes get to enjoy the tyranny of the fact that they've ceded a lot. Anyway, their own concern is not my concern. We are the ones that concern me. But Nigeria is not a unitary state. What evolved is essentially a modern feudal system. I call it a modern feudal system in the sense that the military began to create a new country. But the military itself was essentially a Fulani military, a northern military. This is not a tribal slur. It is a fact of history that at the end of the Civil War, even before the Civil War, number one, leading up to the Civil War, northern soldiers, rank and file, stopped taking orders from southern officers. In the succession to Aguiyi Ironsi, he wasn't the most senior military officer that became the president of Nigeria. He was the most senior northern officer. And the fact that he was the most senior northern officer was only in order to preserve the illusion of one knot. The reality always was that Muritala Muhammad was a prime mover of the second coup, and he more or less shaped the ideological backbone of that government. He eventually took over, and the full extent of what befell Nigeria after 1966 began to come into effect with Muritala Muhammad's regime and the Obasanjo regime that succeeded him. And what happened? One, the centralized command system of the military began to shape the trajectories of Nigeria. So the president will sit down in Dodan Barracks alongside his military coupists. They will decide, okay, we'll create this state or we'll create that state. So the federal government, let's understand, because this is where the fraud begins. It's called the federal government, but it's not really the federal government any longer. It is now the military government, calling itself the federal military government. So that federal government, which means that it is the person at the top or those who control what is happening at the top that determines what happens everywhere else. So I could sit in Dodan Barracks and without care for the interest of the Yoruba, assign them an administrator and determine policies on their behalf. I could assign an administrator to Enugu, to anywhere, any part of the country. So all of a sudden, the very thing that our founding fathers were running away from when they decided that they would only be part of the federal Nigeria overtook us. And it overtook us in the life of this country. Think about it. 1966 to 1960, just 6 years. We hadn't even had any chance to begin to put down rules as a country. And then this tragedy happened. And that tragedy has escalated over the years. But the original fraud imposed upon Nigerians by that tragedy is the 1979 Constitution, which is the only reason I went all the way to explain how we got to that point. So by 1977, even before this gentleman died or was killed, rather, before Muritala Muhammad was killed, there was already, because there were several transition programs. First, it was the one by Gowon, which could not proceed for several reasons that history will tell you. And then the Obasanjo, the Muritala regime came in and he started this process of consultation leading to what he said would be a return to civilian rule. But if you were going to go back to civilian rule, there has to be some sort of constitution, expression of the people's will that would then govern the country in the absence of the guns that they were governing with, because they were governing by decrees, which meant that about 12 people, members of the military, maybe one or two civilians who might not even be able to vote, would sit in a council and determine what they felt was better, was good for the country. People had no vote, people had no say, we were being ruled by soldiers. So these soldiers, recognizing that they had to go, decided that they needed to make a constitution. So in pursuit of a new constitution, the Constituent Assembly was constituted in 1977. This was at least by a process that delineated the country into words, and elections were held. The military government also nominated persons to represent special interests, but the people voted those who should go and express their sovereign will in the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly made copious recommendations, took memoranda up and down the country, eventually presented a document to the military as its draft. If my memory serves me right, that recommendation was significantly altered by the time Obasanjo promulgated it as Decree 103 of 1979. That is the 1979 Constitution. What are the things that the Constituent Assembly recommended that were not reflected, and what are those things that they specifically kicked against that became the 1979 Constitution? I'll share a few. One of them is the presidential system of government. The presidential system of government was not the recommendation of the Constituent Assembly of 1977. It was clear in its recommendation that Nigeria retains the old parliamentary system. But by the time Obasanjo and his cohorts were done, we were left with a presidential system designed along the American presidential system, conveniently ignoring the fact that we were only ever a country because there was an agreement that we lived as distinct peoples who only cooperated in relation to clearly defined matters. There was the residual list, there was the concurrent list, and there was the exclusive list. Power was largely devolved to the regions. But what happened with the 1979 Constitution was that you had first the Land Use Act smuggled into it. You had the NYSC Act smuggled into it. That is before you start dealing with issues like federal character, you start dealing with quota system, before you start dealing with the fact that where before 1960, the enacting authority for all of our constitutions was the Crown. After 1960, the 1963 Constitution, the enacting authority were the sovereign parliaments of the Nigerian peoples, both at the regional and the federal level. What happened with the 1979 Constitution is that it was the will of Obasanjo and his men, and this was clearly reflected in the fact that it was a decree that masqueraded as the 1979 Constitution. The 1979 Constitution is not, or was not, an expression of the will of the Nigerian peoples. And the 1979 Constitution could not endure because, as with all injustice, it could not be sustained. The 1979 Constitution died within 4 years, and I believe 4 years and 3 months of its being promulgated by the military. A lot has happened since 1979. My purpose is not to teach history, but constitutional history is important to an appreciation of the centrality of the Constitution in everyday life of the people and the centrality of citizenship to the process of constitution making. When the military came back in 1984, and the same affliction that afflicts all of us today, Muhammadu Buhari was announced as the president of Nigeria. What happened then was that every pretense of the people's will having ever mattered was thrown overboard. And the dictatorship that took power began to rule by decrees and by dictates. That junta lasted until the gap-toothed monster of Mina came on board. He ruled pretending always to be democratic, even when he was issuing his diktats, because he understood the centrality of the people, even when he would only ever pretend that they mattered. So when important decisions were going to be taken, you would have all sorts of public hearings, bureau of this and that, SAP debates. These were at least lip services were paid. But essentially, Nigeria was ruled by diktats. It simply meant that the biggest guns in the country sat in the Supreme Military Council, ruled by the will of the military. But, cut a long story short, Abacha succeeded him, expired with his Apple and Indian, well, whatever. And then Abdulsalami came on board, the brother with the white beard. That brother clean up, not be small. So the brother came on board, and having come on board, he realized that the sooner he got out of this game, the better for him. He had made enough. Anyway, leave that story. The important thing is this. Brother said, I'm leaving, so we need to have a constitution that will govern the country after the military have gone, and you cannot rule by decrees any longer. So he began to organize what he called town hall debates. And one of the things that came out of these town hall debates, which were judges in a few parts of the country, not involving any one of us, but essentially involving a gathering of different elites in different parts of the country. I'm sorry, I'm having, okay. So this was just involving elites in different parts of the country, and eventually they came together and said, oh, the generally expressed will of the people in these their town halls, where they never gathered up to 1,000 people at any point in time, was that Nigeria should go back to the failed constitution of 1979. So they coupled together this thing they called the constitution, modeled generally around the 1979 constitution, which lasted 4 years and 3 months before its inherent contradictions killed it. So they brought it back together in a worse form, and they labeled it the 1999 constitution. And it was promulgated by Abdulsalam, and Abdulsalam, promulgated it as Decree 24 of 1999. We, the people, question is, who were those people? Unlike the 1979 constitution, which at least pretended to listen to the people by its constituent assembly, before going forward to change what the constituent assembly said to impose the will of the military, this one had no pretense. He simply gathered his own men inside a room somewhere, pretended to be working from the template of the bad constitution of 1979, and simply imposed the will of whoever was in control of those in control of the people sat in that room, and they cobbled together something, and today we have what you know as the 1999 constitution. To its credit, it has endured for 22 years. But the question is this: how well have the people fared in 22 years? Easy to tell. In 1999, when this disaster was being forced on the Nigerian people, I was in the law school. I believe we were just leaving the law school then. And I could travel from Abuja to Lagos unafraid of bandits, unworried about my life. I could take drives all the way to Jos and Kaduna and to Bauchi unafraid for my life. I could still dream and hope. There were enough illusions to keep us hopeful about Nigeria in 1999. Nigeria was not at war with itself yet in 1999. The Nigerian people still had a vibrant press in 1999. But what has happened is that the 1999 Constitution designed a country that was bound to fail. The human spirit is always searching for justice and is unquenchable. That thirst for justice and equity cannot be killed. So when you enact unjust laws that takes away the fundamental right of a people without their consent, it becomes inevitable that at some point, jungle will mature. The Nigerian jungle don't mature, and our horrible animals full our jungle. My intendment this morning is simple. It is to give you the theoretical basis for the argument, explain the precepts, make clear the fact that you as citizens are the ones with powers to make a constitution. You are the ones whose sovereign will are meant to be encapsulated in that document that is called a constitution. Would you be surprised to find that the 1963 constitution, not only, in fact, the 1960 constitution and the one that succeeded it in 1963, not only has room for referendums and plebiscites, it supervised and superintended a few. It was used in the creation of the Midwest region. It was used in determining the fate of Northern Cameroon. It was used in determining, for instance, whether the Kaba and Ilorin provinces were part of the West. Not that it was ever tested or submitted to the people, but it was there. And on the two occasions that this matter was taken up until the 1958 Minorities Commission, where it was raised, it was also recognized that the laws, the constitutional provisions as it related to referendums and plebiscites would be invoked at the appropriate time to determine the status of those provinces based on the claims of the Western region. The important thing to take away from this is to understand that there is nothing unique about the questions that we are asking, which is that the sovereign will of the people be allowed to reign supreme. This is merely the first part of what is going to be a two-part series. There is a lot to talk about, and I've decided that I'll just break it in two as I've done now. I've more or less effectively come to the end of the first part, but there is something I said it in another sphere, but I believe that it is actually relevant to what we're discussing. And it's something that I posted, I believe, 4 years ago. Facebook reminded me this morning, so I reposted it across my channels. And what it says is, do not get lost finding you. It's very easy to get lost finding you. And the issue of the Nigerian constitution is one of those things where you have to be careful not to get lost trying to find yourself. To avoid getting lost finding you, you must be anchored. And anchors will suggest clarity as to what the truths are and what your position in relation to the truth must be at all times. You have to be anchored to the truth so that by the time you're searching for whatever you're searching for, if you have fidelity to the truth, you will not depart from what the truth is and will not get lost. In seeking to find solutions for Nigeria, we must be careful to stay loyal to the truth. This is important whether we are speaking as agitators against this unjust system, or whether we are speaking in defense of what some of us believe to be a moribund system. We must all agree to be bound by the truth. We might be entitled, as have been said variously, to our opinions, but we definitely are not entitled to our own facts. The fact, as it relates to the Nigerian constitution, is that what we have today is a fraud. It is not a constitution. Every time you walk away from that fact, you start getting lost. What we have today as well is that our citizenship have been discounted. If our citizenships are not discounted, the centrality of our consent to how we wish to be governed should not be a matter of debate. Surely it should not be a matter of debate. But we have gotten lost in the midst of all the lies that we have embraced and in our search for the self-evident truth that we all can see. I will see you on Wednesday by the grace of God. I have deliberately scheduled that second part for Wednesday because of the charade and fraud being undertaken by the National Assembly in the name of a constitutional review effort. I'll close by making this comparison. If I set out from Ajah with the intention of going to Ibadan, but I head in the direction of Badagry, however long I travel on the road to Badagry, I'm not going to end up. If I am a rational being, even if I had missed my way simply because of one error or the other, I will listen to those who are pointing me in the right direction, and I will begin my journey on the right path. Nigeria began its wrong journey in 1966. That journey has taken it through a civil war. It has brought it to a point where he's almost at his knee again. And this time around, I'm not sure that he will survive if it goes into this one. He's already in it, but it can still pull back from the brink of this abyss. Do not get lost. Hmm? Finding you. I will see you on Wednesday. Do enjoy your weekend and please do stay safe. God bless you. And may God save each and every one of us. Mind you, use your God given brain. It's the only way out of this mess. Have a lovely